I was in the middle of firing someone when my phone started buzzing with my sister's ringtone, and I remember being annoyed about it before I was anything else. That tells you most of what you need to know about who I was that year. The someone I was firing was a junior project manager named Denny who had submitted a lighting plan with the wrong ceiling heights for the third time, and I was not being cruel about it. I want to be clear. I was being precise. I have never once raised my voice at an employee. I have never needed to. I have a way of going quiet and specific that people say is worse than yelling, and I have never disagreed with that assessment because it's true and because it works. The heights are off by 4 inches across the entire east wing, I said. That's not a rounding error, Denny. That's a wall in the wrong place. Denny was nodding the way people nod when they've stopped listening and started calculating how much notice they're legally owed. My phone kept buzzing on the conference table, face down, and I let it ring out twice before I picked it up on the third try, more out of reflex than concern, and said, "Give me 1 second," to Denny, who did not look relieved so much as reprieved. "Kamari," my sister's voice. Ren never called me by anything but my full name, not even when we were kids, and I'd learned a long time ago that meant nothing, so I didn't brace for anything. "I'm in a meeting." Uncle Elias died this morning. I want to tell you I felt something enormous and immediate, some crack down the middle of the day, but what I actually felt was a strange, embarrassing blankness, like being handed a piece of paper in a language I used to speak fluently and forgot. Elias was my mother's older brother, a man I had met maybe a dozen times in my life, most of them before I was 12. He lived 4 hours north at a lake I'd been to exactly twice, once for a summer when I was 9, and once for his wife's funeral when I was 22. He sent a card every year at Christmas with the same handwriting getting shakier, and I sent one back with my assistant's handwriting, and that was the entire architecture of our relationship for over a decade. "Okay," I said, because I didn't know what else to say, and because Denny was still sitting there watching me have a phone call about a death like it was a scheduling conflict. "He left you the house," Ren said. "The lake house. All of it. The lawyer's been trying to reach you for 2 days, Kamari. He says you haven't returned his calls." "I don't check that voicemail." "You don't check any voicemail. That's not a personality trait, that's a problem." I told Denny to email me a revised drawing by end of day, and to sit with Priya on the east wing measurements before submitting anything else, and I said this while my sister was still talking, which I recognize now was not my finest moment, but at the time it felt like competence. It felt like being the kind of person who could hold 2 rooms in his head at once and not drop either of them. I had built an entire company on being that kind of person. Solane Design Group did not exist 9 years ago. 9 years ago, I was a 31-year-old architect with a business loan I'd lied to my parents about the size of. And now I had 4 offices and a client list that included 2 hotel chains and a senator's summer estate. And none of that had happened by accident or luck. It had happened because I did not let things slip. I did not let calls go unreturned for 2 days, except apparently when the call was about my uncle dying, in which case I had let it go unreturned for 2 days without even knowing I was doing it. "You need to go up there," Ren said. "Someone has to sign for the estate in person. There's a caretaker situation. Kamari, are you listening to me?" "I'm listening." You get quiet like that when you're not listening. "I get quiet like this when I'm listening carefully," I said, which was, admittedly, something I said often enough that it had stopped being funny to anyone but me. Here is what I want you to understand about the next part, because I've turned it over enough times since to know exactly how it looked from the outside, and exactly how little that had to do with how it felt from the inside. I did not want to go to Cedar Lake. I had a groundbreaking in Denver in 11 days. I had a reputation, hard-won and expensive, for being the kind of principal who showed up to every site visit personally, who did not delegate the things that mattered, and disappearing for a week to deal with a dead relative's lake house felt like exactly the kind of soft, sentimental detour that the version of me I'd built could not afford. I told Ren I would send our family's lawyer, a woman named Odette, who had handled our father's estate and was, by any reasonable measure, better suited to this than I was. Odette can't sign for you, Kamari. It has to be you. And there's a caretaker up there who's apparently been keeping the place from falling into the lake for the last 4 years without being paid properly. And somebody owes him back wages and an explanation, and that somebody is you now. Send me the file. I'll have someone look into the caretaker. I'm not asking someone to go. I'm asking you. A pause, the kind my sister used like punctuation, sharp and deliberate. You haven't taken a vacation in 3 years. I checked. I asked your assistant. That's an invasion of privacy. That's concern, you enormous idiot. And I'm allowed to have it. I'm your sister. Another pause, softer this time. He left you the house on purpose, Kamari. He could have left it to me, or split it, or sold it before he died and just left us the money. He left you the actual house. I think he wanted you to go there. I didn't say anything to that for a second, because it landed somewhere I wasn't expecting. Some old, unused room in myself I hadn't checked on in a while. I remembered, suddenly and completely, being 9 years old on that lake, my uncle teaching me to skip stones off the same dock his father had taught him on, telling me I was doing it wrong, in a voice that had none of the impatience my own voice carried when I corrected people now. I remembered the water being so clean you could see your own feet standing in it. I remembered thinking, the way children think things without any sense of how temporary the thought is, that I would come back every summer for the rest of my life. I had not been back in 13 years. Fine, I said. I'll go this weekend. 2 days. I'll sign whatever needs signing. I'll deal with the caretaker, and then I'm listing it. I don't have time to own a lake house, Wren. You don't have time to own anything you actually like, she said. That's your whole thing. And then she said something about our mother wanting to know if I'd come by before. I drove up, and I said I would try, knowing I wouldn't, and we hung up, and I looked at Denny, who was still sitting across the conference table from me like a man waiting to hear whether his execution had been rescheduled. Where were we? I said. You were firing me, Denny said, with more dignity than I probably deserved from him. I was correcting you. There's a difference. Fix the drawing. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and did not think about my uncle again for the rest of that day, or told myself I didn't, which is its own kind of lie I was good at telling. I want to be honest about who I was driving 4 hours north 11 days later, because the man who arrived at Cedar Lake that Friday afternoon is not someone I'm particularly proud of, though I understood him better than I let on, even to myself. I was 35 years old. I had built something real out of nothing, and I had done it by being unreasonable about details in a way that made people slightly afraid of me, which I had decided, somewhere along the way, was an acceptable trade for being taken seriously. I had dated women twice in my 20s, briefly and without much conviction, because it was easier than the alternative, and I had told myself and everyone else that I was simply too busy for anything more permanent, which had the added benefit of being at least partially true. I had known what I was since I was 14 years old, and had built, over the following 21 years, an entire personality specifically engineered so that no one would ever have to ask me about it. Solane Design Group had a reputation. I had a reputation. My father, before he died, had been the kind of man who used words like lifestyle with a particular flatness that told you everything about what he meant and nothing about what he'd say if you pushed him on it. And I had never pushed him on it because I had decided a long time ago that the cost of finding out wasn't worth the information. So I drove north with a garment bag and a box of legal folders on the passenger seat, expecting exactly what my sister had promised me. Paperwork, dust, a stranger who was owed money, and a house I would sign over to a realtor by Sunday night and never think about again. I did not expect Maverick. I don't say that because it's a clean way to end a chapter, although I recognize that it is. I say it because it's the truest sentence I have about that whole weekend, the one that undoes every plan I made in the car on the drive up. I had my whole life organized around not being surprised by things. I checked drawings 4 times. I read contracts twice before signing and once after. I did not believe, as a rule, in things happening to me that I hadn't already accounted for. Cedar Lake accounted for nothing. That was the whole problem, and eventually, the whole gift. Chapter 2, Cedar Lake. The town, if you could call it that, was called Amber Hollow, and it sat on the western shore of Cedar Lake like something that had been there so long it had stopped noticing the water. One gas station. One diner with a hand-painted sign that had been repainted so many times the letters had gone soft at the edges. A hardware store that also sold fishing licenses and, according to a handwritten note taped to the register, worms if Pete's in a good mood. I drove through the whole of it in under 4 minutes and felt something in my chest loosen slightly. The specific and unfamiliar relief of being somewhere no one had ever heard of Solane Design Group. The house was 3 miles past the last of it, down a gravel road that my car's suspension did not appreciate, and I want to describe it the way I saw it for the first time, because I think it tells you something about my uncle that I hadn't understood while he was alive. It was not a grand house. I designed buildings for people with more money than sense. Glass boxes cantilevered over cliffs. Kitchens the size of my childhood home. And I say that not to be self-important, but so you understand the eye I was seeing this place through. Elias's house was a 2-story cedar shingle cabin with a wraparound porch that had clearly been added by hand at some point. Not quite level, the kind of imperfection that a client would have made me tear out and redo. The roof line sagged very slightly on the north side. There was a stone chimney that had gone the soft gray-green of old lichen. And past all of it, close enough that I could hear it from the car with the windows up, the lake, flat and silver in the late afternoon light, exactly as clean as I remembered it, which surprised me more than it should have. What surprised me more than the lake was the dock. It had been rebuilt. Not the whole thing. I could see where the old graying boards gave way, maybe a third of the way out, to new cedar planking, pale and raw and clearly recent, laid with a straightness and care that made something in my professional brain sit up and pay attention before the rest of me caught up. The joinery was clean. Someone had mitered the corner boards instead of butting them, which is more work and looks better, and almost no one bothers with it on a dock nobody important is going to see. I found out later that the someone was the reason I hadn't returned to this house sooner even mattering, though I didn't know that yet, standing in the gravel driveway with my garment bag over one shoulder, looking at a dock repair with more attention than I'd given most of my actual projects that quarter. I let myself into the house with the key Odette had couriered to my office, and it smelled the way old wooden houses smell. Cedar and dust and something faintly like wood smoke that had soaked into the walls over 50 years and never quite left. The furniture was old but not neglected. Someone had been dusting, I noted. Someone had kept the windows from fogging with mildew. Someone had clearly been in this house recently enough and often enough that it didn't have the abandoned, held breath quality I'd expected from a place its owner hadn't lived in full time for the last several years of failing health. There was a note on the kitchen table. Handwriting I didn't recognize, small and careful and slightly slanted. Mr. Voss, turn the water back on and lit the pilot for the water heater. Should have hot water by the time you read this. There's wood stacked on the porch if it gets cold tonight. This time of year it still can. Left the caretaker file on the counter. Everything's up to date through last month. Sorry about your uncle. He was a good man to me. M. Race. I read it twice, the way I read everything, and felt something I couldn't immediately name at the smallness and specificity of it. Should have hot water by the time you read this. Someone had thought about the timing of my arrival, had done the math on when I'd get here and lit a pilot light accordingly, had stacked wood on a porch for a nephew he'd never met, coming to sell a house out from under him. The caretaker file on the counter was a manila folder, and it was, I want to be clear, the most meticulously organized set of property records I had encountered outside of my own firm. Every invoice itemized, every repair log with date, material cost, and hours. A running list of deferred maintenance, recommend addressing before next winter, with a level of technical specificity that told me whoever wrote it understood load-bearing structures better than most contractors I'd fired for incompetence. There was a section at the back, separate, paper-clipped, that made my stomach do something unpleasant. 11 months of invoices for caretaking services, none of them marked paid, the total at the bottom circled twice in pencil, and then, it looked like, erased and not recircled, as if the person writing it had thought better of drawing attention to the number. 11 months. My uncle had been sick for at least that long, Wren had said, in and out of the hospital in the nearest city an hour away, and somebody had kept this house standing, and this dock rebuilt, and this water running for 11 months without being paid, and had then, upon that man's death, lit a pilot light for the stranger inheriting everything, and left instead of waiting around to ask about the money he was owed. I did not know yet that this was, in miniature, the entire shape of the man I was about to meet. Somebody who did the work and did not ask to be seen doing it. Somebody who left before the asking could become uncomfortable for anyone but himself. I made a note, an actual note, on the legal pad I'd brought, because that was how my brain worked whether I was buying a hotel site or standing in a dead man's kitchen, to write a check first thing, generous with interest, before I did anything else. Then I went looking for firewood on the porch because Wren had been right about one thing at least. It was already getting cold, the particular damp cold that comes off a lake at dusk, and I stood out there for a long minute with an armful of split cedar, looking out at the water going the color of a bruise as the sun dropped behind the far tree line, and felt, for the first time and longer than I wanted to admit, entirely unhurried. It didn't last. Nothing about that weekend went the way I'd planned, and the unhurried feeling was the first plan to go, though not the last. I heard the truck before I saw it. An old one, the kind that announces itself a quarter mile off with a particular rattle in the muffler, coming down the gravel road just as the light was properly failing. I assumed, reasonably, that it was a neighbor, or Odette's local contact, or someone come to gawk at the new owner, the way small towns apparently still did, according to every movie I'd ever half watched about small towns. I did not assume it was the man who'd written the note. Come back, I found out, because he'd forgotten he'd left his good level in the boathouse and needed it for a job in the morning, and had not expected anyone to actually be at the house yet, because the note he'd left had said Sunday and I had, uncharacteristically, arrived Friday, 3 days ahead of my own schedule, because I couldn't stand the idea of the drawn-out anticipation of it and had simply left work a day early without telling anyone but my assistant. So neither of us was prepared for the other, which I've come to think was the only reason it went the way it did. If I'd had time to prepare, I would have handled it like a negotiation. If he'd had time to prepare, I don't think he would have come at all. Chapter 3: The Man on the Dock. I didn't go out to meet the truck. I told myself this was because I didn't want to seem like I'd been waiting around for company, though the truth was simpler and less flattering. I was tired and cold and holding an armful of firewood, and it seemed like more trouble than it was worth to set it all down for whoever this was. So I stood on the porch in the near dark, half in shadow, and I watched. He didn't come to the house at all, which I noted with some surprise. He parked the truck at an angle I recognized, the specific unconscious angle of someone who's parked in that exact spot hundreds of times and doesn't need to think about it, and he walked instead toward the boathouse at the edge of the property, a flashlight beam bouncing ahead of him over the grass. He moved like someone who knew the ground by feel. Not fast, not careful in an exaggerated way, just economical, the walk of a man who has never had to think about where his feet were going to land on this particular stretch of grass, because he's done it in the dark 1,000 times before. I want to describe him honestly without dressing it up, because I think what happened to me on that porch was not what people mean when they talk about a stranger being handsome across a room. He was tall and lean in the way of people who work with their hands and don't think about it as exercise, and even from that distance, in bad light, I could see the particular set of his shoulders that people get from carrying things: lumber, coolers, other people's expectations. That's not what stopped me. What stopped me was the dog. A dog came tearing out from somewhere near the boathouse, the second his truck door shut, a scruffy, low-slung thing that was clearly not his. Clearly a neighbor's dog that had simply adopted this stretch of shoreline as its territory the way dogs in small towns do, and he crouched immediately, before he'd even reached the boathouse door, and let it barrel into him without flinching, one hand going straight to scratch behind its ears, in a motion so automatic it barely qualified as a decision. He said something to the dog I couldn't hear. The dog's whole back half was wagging. He stayed crouched there for a good 15 seconds, just letting the animal have that, before he straightened up and kept walking, flashlight beam swinging back toward the boathouse door. I have known a great many people in my life who are performing kindness for an audience. I have built an entire career of reading rooms full of people who wanted to be seen being reasonable, being generous, being easy to work with, right up until the moment they thought no one important was watching. This man had no idea anyone was watching at all, and he'd stopped what he was doing to give a stray dog 15 honest seconds of his attention anyway, in the cold, in the dark, on his way to retrieve a tool he'd forgotten. It is a small thing. I am aware it is a small thing. I have turned it over more times since than is probably reasonable for a small thing, and I still think it was the first true fact I learned about him, before I knew his name, before I'd heard his voice. That he was kind when it cost him nothing to be otherwise, and kind when there was no one to perform it for. He let himself into the boathouse with a key he clearly kept on his own ring, not the one Odette had sent me, and the flashlight. Beam moved around inside for a minute before he came back out holding something. The level, though I didn't know that yet, and paused on the little dock that ran along the boathouse to look out at the water. He just stood there, not doing anything. Not on his phone, not talking to the dog, which had followed him and was now sitting at his feet, looking up at him with the specific patient devotion of an animal that has decided a person belongs to it. He stood at the edge of the dock in the last gray light, with the level held loose in one hand, and looked at the lake the way you look at something you've looked at 10,000 times and never once gotten tired of. And I understood, watching him, that I was looking at someone who had a whole private relationship with this place that had nothing to do with money or ownership or deeds, and that whatever that relationship was, I had just inherited the right to interrupt it. I shifted my weight on the porch, and the old boards did what old boards do, and he turned. Even at that distance, even in bad light, I could see him go still in the specific way people go still when they've just realized they're not alone and are recalculating very fast exactly how much of themselves they'd just shown to a stranger. The dog's ears pricked up before he even moved. He didn't call out right away. He stood there for a second with the level still in his hand, and I stood there on the porch with an armful of firewood I'd forgotten I was holding. And for that one suspended moment, neither of us said anything at all. Two men looking at each other across 40 yards of dark grass. Both of us, I think, now doing the exact same math. Who is this, and what do they already know about me? Didn't expect anyone out here till Sunday, he called finally, and his voice surprised me. It was quieter than I expected, and lower, with a rough edge at the front of it like he didn't use it much and had to warm it up before it worked right. And it carried across the dark yard with a kind of careful neutrality that I would come to recognize over the following days as a very deliberate choice. This was not, I understood later, a man who was naturally quiet. This was a man who had trained himself to be, the way you train a limb back into use after an injury, and you could still hear, underneath the caution, the shape of a voice that had once been built to fill much bigger rooms than this one. Change of plans, I said. I'm Kamari, Elias's nephew. Another pause. The flashlight beam dropped, pointed at the ground between us instead of at either of our faces, which I noticed and didn't understand the significance of until much later. The particular instinct of someone who has learned, the hard way, not to let anyone get a clear look at his face without his say-so. Figured, he said. I'm the one who left the note. Maverick, I said, raise. I don't know how I knew that before he said it, except that I'd read the initial and the last name a dozen times in that kitchen file in the last hour, turning the shape of it over without a face to put to it, and something about hearing his actual voice made the letters resolve into a whole person all at once, standing 40 yards away in the dark, with a dog at his feet and a level in his hand, and 11 months of unpaid invoices folded into a manila folder on the kitchen counter behind me. Sorry about your uncle, he said. And even across that distance, even through the deliberate flatness he was clearly holding onto with both hands, I could hear that he meant it. More than the ordinary condolence-shaped weight those words usually carry. He was decent to me when he didn't have to be. So I gathered, I said, and gestured uselessly at the house behind me, at the folder I couldn't point to from here. You should come in. It's cold, and I have questions, and I think I owe you a considerable amount of money. He didn't move for a second. The dog looked between us like it was waiting for a verdict. That's all right, he said. You don't owe me anything you don't want to pay. That's not how debt works, I said. But I appreciate the sentiment. And I heard, even as I said it, how much it sounded like something I'd say in a boardroom. Precise and slightly clinical. And I watched him hear it too. Watched something in his posture settle into a kind of wary politeness. The specific shape of a man deciding he was dealing with someone from the city who talked like that on purpose. He wasn't wrong. I just hadn't decided yet whether I minded him thinking it. I'll come up, he said finally. Just for a minute. Got an early start tomorrow. He whistled once, low, and the dog peeled off toward the tree line without complaint, clearly bound for whatever house actually fed it, and he came up across the dark yard toward the porch light with a level still hanging from one hand, and it was only when he came into the range of the porch bulb that I saw his face properly for the first time, a face that was doing a very careful job of giving nothing away. And doing it so well that it took me a full week to understand how much effort that carefulness cost him every single day, and how long it had been since anyone had bothered to notice the cost at all. Chapter 4, Introductions. He wiped his boots on the mat before he came in, which was such a small, ordinary courtesy that I noticed it the way you notice things when you're paying more attention than the moment strictly requires. Up close, in the kitchen light, he looked younger than the voice had suggested, 26 or 27, with a couple days of stubble and the kind of tan that comes from actual outdoor work rather than vacation, and eyes that kept doing a very specific thing, landing on my face, cataloging something, then moving deliberately to a neutral point on the wall or the floor, like he'd trained himself out of holding eye contact too long with people he didn't know yet. It read at first like shyness. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand it was something closer to vigilance. You want coffee, or is it too late in the night for that? I said, mostly because I didn't know what else to offer a man I'd just met in my dead uncle's kitchen, and because I genuinely didn't know if it was rude or generous to offer anything at all. I'm all right. He was looking at the folder on the counter, the one with his own careful handwriting on the outside tab. You found the file. I read the whole thing, twice. I picked it up, open to the back section, the paper-clipped invoices with the circled and uncircled total. 11 months, Maverick. Something crossed his face fast enough that I almost missed it. Not quite embarrassment. Something closer to being caught at something he hadn't meant for anyone to see. He was sick a long time before he told anyone he was sick. I wasn't going to send bills to a man who was dying. You could have sent them to me. Didn't know you existed till 3 days ago. He said it without heat, just fact, and it landed harder than I think he meant it to, because it was true. And because it was the kind of true that made me look briefly at the last 13 years of my own life from an angle I generally avoided. Your uncle didn't talk about family much. Didn't seem like a sore subject exactly. Just private. That sounds right, I said. We're a private family. It's practically the crest. That got something out of him. Not quite a laugh, but a short exhale through the nose that might have been the ancestor of one. And for just a second, the vigilance in his eyes eased off enough that I got a clearer look at what was underneath it. Someone quick, someone paying close attention to everything I said in a way that felt less like suspicion and more like a man who'd learned that details mattered and hadn't been able to unlearn it since. I'm going to pay you everything on that invoice, I said, plus interest, plus whatever the going rate is for putting up with a client who doesn't answer his own mail for 11 months. I'll have a check for you by tomorrow. You don't have to do the interest part. I do, actually. It's not optional. I run a company, I know what deferred payment costs people, and it's not nothing. I watched him try to figure out whether to argue with that and decide it wasn't worth the energy, which I would also come to recognize as one of his most consistent traits. He picked his battles with the specific economy of someone who had once had to fight a great many of them and had learned the hard way which ones were worth the cost. Appreciate it, he said, which seemed to be the full extent of what he was willing to say on the subject. And then, glancing at the deferred maintenance list, still sitting open on the counter, you're going to want to deal with the north gutter before the fall rains, by the way. It's pulling away from the fascia board. I patched it twice, but it needs to actually come down and get replaced properly. And the roofline on that side's got a soft spot. I didn't want to mess with myself. Didn't have the right ladder for it. I looked at the list again with new eyes, hearing his voice describe problems he'd clearly spent real time worrying about on a house that wasn't his for a man who couldn't pay him, and said, "You wrote all of this." Somebody had to keep track. "No," I said. "I mean, this is good work. This is better organized than half my project files, and I run an architecture firm." I hadn't meant to say the second half of that sentence. Some old instinct to establish credentials before I'd even decided whether I wanted him to be impressed by it. And I watched him take the information in and file it somewhere without comment, no visible reaction at all, which was itself a kind of tell, because most people react to "I run an architecture firm," and his flat non-reaction told me he'd already priced me as a certain kind of person the moment I opened my mouth in the boardroom voice on the porch, and finding out I had an actual title to go with it hadn't changed the assessment. "You do construction work, or just caretaking?" I asked. "Whatever pays," he said. "Caretaking for a few places on this side of the lake. Some carpentry. I help out at the hardware store when Pete needs an extra set of hands." A short pause, and something in his jaw tightened very slightly, like he was deciding whether to say the next part at all. "Used to do other things." Such as, "Doesn't matter now." Flat. Final. A door closing with no slam to it at all, just a quiet and complete click. And I recognized, even that first night, that I had walked right up to the edge of something and been shown, politely but unmistakably, exactly where the boundary was. I filed it away the way I file away every unresolved detail on a project. Not forgotten, just waiting for the right moment to be raised again. I noticed on my way to get him a glass of water he hadn't asked for but accepted anyway. A case sitting on the passenger seat of his truck through the kitchen window. A hard black case, the kind that looks purpose-built for something more delicate than tools, with a strap worn soft and pale at the edges from handling. I didn't ask about it that night. I want to be honest that I noticed it and chose not to ask, because he had just shown me, with real clarity, that there were things he wasn't going to discuss with a stranger in a kitchen at 9 at night, and some instinct I don't fully understand even now told me that pushing on it would cost me more than the answer was worth. "I should get going," he said, level still hanging from one hand, water glass empty on the counter. "Early morning. You need anything before Sunday. My number's on the file. I'll come by end of the week to look at that gutter if you want, or I can leave it for whoever you hire to do the work on the place before you sell it." There was something in the way he said "before you sell it" that I couldn't quite place at the time. Not quite bitter, nothing so simple as that, but a kind of preemptive resignation. Like he'd already decided, without my saying a word about my plans, exactly how this was going to go. A city man inherits a lake house, hires someone to fix it up, sells it to someone else who'll use it 2 weeks a year, and call a service to mow the lawn the other 50. I understood later that he'd watched this exact story happen to 3 other houses on this side of the lake in the last 5 years. Watched the caretaking work dry up as the old owners, who knew everyone's names, got replaced by management companies who didn't, and he was simply doing the math on how much longer he had a reason to drive down this gravel road at all. "I haven't decided anything yet," I said, which was true in the narrowest possible sense. I had absolutely decided to sell. I had decided it in the car 11 days ago before I'd even seen the place, and something about his face told me he didn't believe the sentence for a second and was too polite, or too tired, to say so. "Sure," he said. "Well, nice to meet you, Kamari." My name in his voice for the first time, low and a little rough at the edges, and I felt it land somewhere I hadn't given permission for it to land. Some old unlit room lighting up without my consent. "Sorry it's under these circumstances." "Likewise," I said, and meant it more than the word usually carries. I watched his truck lights swing back down the gravel road and disappear behind the tree line, and I stood in that kitchen for a long time afterward, longer than the moment reasonably required, looking at a manila folder full of a stranger's careful handwriting, thinking about a level held loose in one hand and a dog getting 15 honest seconds of attention it hadn't asked for, and I remember. thinking, with the specific dread of a man who has spent his entire adult life avoiding exactly this feeling, this is going to complicate things. I did not yet understand how much, or how gladly in the end I would let it. Chapter 5: The House That Wouldn't Sell Itself. I called Odette Saturday morning to tell her to start drafting the listing paperwork, and then I did not send the email. And I want to be honest that I don't fully understand why, even now though. I've had a long time to think about it. What I told myself was that a house in this condition needed at least a season of basic repairs before it would fetch anything close to what it was worth, and that overseeing the first phase myself, just the initial scope of work, was a sound business decision and not at all an excuse to stay in a town I'd been in for less than 18 hours. I have made a career out of being able to tell the difference between a sound business decision and a rationalization. And I wanted on the record that I knew, even as I was making the argument to myself, that I was lying. And I made it anyway, because some part of me, that rarely got a vote, had apparently decided to start voting. I drove into Amber Hollow for coffee, because the pot at the house was older than I was comfortable trusting, and the diner, Ruthie's, according to the sign, had exactly 4 other customers in it at 9 in the morning, all of whom looked up when I walked in with the specific unhurried curiosity of people who know every face that's supposed to be in a room and had just met an exception. "You're Elias's people," the woman behind the counter said, before I'd said a word, in a tone that made it clear this wasn't a question. "Kamari, his nephew. Ruthie." She poured coffee I hadn't ordered yet and set it in front of me like the matter was settled. "Sorry about your uncle. Good man. Terrible tipper, but a good man." A couple of the other customers laughed at that in the specific way of people repeating an old joke they'd clearly made about him for years. Fondly, the kind of joke that only exists because someone was well-liked enough to earn it. "You meet Maverick yet?" I have negotiated 8-figure contracts without my expression changing, and I would like to think it held mostly at the sudden and specific attention that came with hearing his name out loud from a stranger, though something in Ruthie's face suggested she clocked something anyway. Briefly, last night. "He's been keeping that place standing since before your uncle got sick enough to need it kept standing," said one of the men at the counter, not unkindly, in the tone of someone correcting a small but important record. "Good with his hands. Better with a camera if you ask me, but don't tell him I said that. He'll deny it till Tuesday." "A camera," I repeated, and I heard how careful I sounded, trying to keep the question light. "Boy could have made something of that if things gone different for him," Ruthie said, and something passed between her and the man at the counter, a look with history in it, and she didn't finish the thought, and neither of them offered to. And I understood, sitting there with a cup of coffee I hadn't asked for, that I had walked into a town that knew things about Maverick Rays that they were not going to hand a stranger over breakfast, out of a kind of loyalty I found myself unexpectedly moved by. Whatever had happened to him, wherever he'd come from before Cedar Lake, these people had decided, collectively and apparently without much discussion, that it wasn't theirs to tell. "He's a good one," Ruthie said instead, refilling my cup, though I'd barely touched it. "Keeps to himself more than he used to, but he's good people. You'd do right to treat him fair, whatever you end up doing with that house." "I intend to." "Hmm?" she said, in a tone that suggested she'd take that under advisement, and moved down the counter to argue with someone about the price of bait, and I sat there, with my coffee going lukewarm, turning over the phrase "whatever things had gone different for him" like a stone I couldn't skip, right? I spent the rest of that Saturday walking the property with the deferred maintenance list, cross-referencing it against what I could see with my own eyes, and I want to say plainly that every single item on Maverick's list checked out. The gutter really was pulling away exactly where he'd said. The soft spot on the roofline was real, and worse than he'd let on, the kind of thing that becomes a 5-figure problem if you leave it through one more hard winter. He had not been padding hours or inflating the scope to justify a bigger check, which I had, I'm ashamed to admit, half expected, some old professional cynicism about people who do maintenance work for property they don't own. If anything, he'd underestimated the labor on 2 separate items, listing hours that no competent contractor could have actually done the work in, which told me either he was better and faster than anyone I employed, or he'd been quietly eating some of his own time so the number wouldn't look too large next to a dying man's bank account. I wrote the check that afternoon. I added 40% to the total for the interest and the underestimated hours, rounded up generously, and drove it out to the address. Ruthie gave me without being asked twice, a small house at the edge of town with a detached shed out back that had clearly been reinforced and re-roofed with more care than the main house. And I understood, looking at it from the truck window without getting out, exactly what that shed probably was, and felt something tighten in my chest that I chose not to examine too closely at the time. He wasn't home. I left the check in an envelope wedged in his screen door, with a note, my handwriting, which I am told looks like it belongs to someone angrier than I generally am. That said only, paid in full, plus interest, plus a correction for the hours you clearly undercharged on the roofline and the dock. Don't argue with me about the math, I do this for a living. KV. I got a text that evening, the first of what would become, over the following 2 weeks, a long and increasingly comfortable thread, and I still have it, saved, though I've never told him that. You added too much. I'm not going to fight you about it because I don't have the energy tonight. But you should know I noticed. I wrote back, noted. Fight me about it in person if you feel strongly enough. I'll be at the house all week. There was a longer pause than the previous exchange had, long enough that I found myself watching the phone in a way that embarrassed me a little, and then, all week. Thought you were selling? I haven't decided anything yet, I wrote, again, and this time it was less of a lie than it had been 2 days before, and I think some part of me already knew that, sitting on that porch with the lake going dark in front of me and a phone in my hand that I kept checking for no reason I was willing to name. Gutter really does need doing before the rain comes in, he wrote back eventually. I can start Monday if you're still around. I'll be around, I wrote, and put the phone down and looked out at the water and did not call Odette about the listing. Not that week, not for a good while after. Chapter 6. What the Light Caught. He started on the gutter Monday morning, early enough that I woke to the sound of his ladder against the north side of the house before my alarm went off, and I made coffee for 2 without entirely deciding to, and brought a cup out to him around 8, and that became, without either of us naming it as a habit, the actual shape of the next 2 weeks. I would work from the porch table with my laptop and a cell signal that came and went, like weather, handling what Solane Design Group actually required of me from 4 hours away, which turned out to be considerably less than I'd always insisted it required. And he would work on the house, and somewhere around mid-morning and again around 4, we would end up in the same. 6 feet of space, drinking coffee, not saying very much, both of us apparently comfortable with that in a way I hadn't expected from myself. I noticed the case again on the second day. He'd left the truck unlocked, windows down, parked closer to the house than usual because he was hauling gutter stock up from the bed of it, and the hard black case was sitting on the passenger seat again, and this time, when he caught me looking at it, he didn't change the subject the way he had the first night. You can look if you want, he said, not quite meeting my eyes, in the tone of someone offering something that cost him more than the words let on. It's not a secret. People don't usually ask. I'm asking. He set down the length of gutter stock he was carrying and went to the truck and brought the case up onto the porch table, unlatching it with the specific care of someone handling something worth more to him than its resale value. And inside, nested in gray foam, was a camera I didn't recognize the model of but could tell, even from a glance, was not cheap, not new, well used and better maintained. The kind of equipment that told you a story about its owner's priorities before he said a single word about himself. Yours. Mine, a beat, was going to be more than that once. He didn't offer more, and I didn't push, remembering the flat closed door from the first night, but he did, unprompted, pull a battered folder out from under the foam insert and slide it across the table toward me without quite looking at what he was doing, the specific studied casualness of someone trying to make an enormous gesture look like nothing at all. The prints inside were black and white, mostly, a few in muted color, and I want to tell you plainly and without exaggeration that they were good. Not good for an amateur, not good for a caretaker with a camera he kept in his truck. Good, full stop. The kind of good I recognized from juried gallery walls I'd walk through with clients who paid absurd amounts for work with a fraction of this feeling in it. A shot of the lake at dawn with the mist still sitting on it in a low gray blanket, composed so the eye went exactly where he wanted it to go, and then kept finding new things to look at after that. An old woman's hands shelling peas on a porch somewhere, every crease and vein rendered with a tenderness that had nothing sentimental in it and everything true. A single shot of the boathouse dock at Blue Hour that I recognized instantly as the same dock I'd watched him standing on the night we met, though this photograph had been taken, according to the pencil note on the back, 3 years earlier, and I understood, looking at it, that this was a place he'd been quietly, privately in love with for a long time before I ever showed up to complicate his claim on it. "You should be doing this," I said, and I meant it as simply and completely as I have ever meant anything. "Professionally, not as a hobby you keep in a truck." Something shuddered in his face fast, the door from the first night swinging most of the way closed again. "Used to try." "What happened?" He was quiet long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer at all, gathering the prints back into the folder with more care than the moment required, squaring the edges twice though they were already square. "Life happened," he said finally, which was, I would learn, his standard answer for an enormous amount of territory he wasn't ready to walk me through yet, a phrase that did the work of a locked door while sounding, to anyone who didn't know him well enough to hear the weight underneath it, like an ordinary shrug. I do it for myself now, that's enough. I didn't believe that last sentence, not the way he said it, with a little too much finality, the specific overcorrection of someone convincing himself of something he didn't fully believe either. But I let it go, because I could see what it cost him to say even that much, and because some instinct told me that Maverick Ray's was not a door you forced. He was a door you left unlocked and waited by, patiently, for as long as it took. "Can I keep this one?" I asked, holding up the dawn shot of the lake, the mist and the silver water, and he looked at me for a long moment with an expression I couldn't fully read, surprise mostly, and something more careful underneath it, like he was recalculating some assumption he'd made about what kind of man I was. "It's not for sale," he said, but he was already sliding it out of the stack, setting it apart from the others. I didn't ask to buy it. Another pause, longer this time, and then quiet. "Yeah, all right, you can have it." I had it framed within the week, sent to a place in the city that did rush work for clients who couldn't wait, and I hung it in the entryway of the lake house where anyone walking in would see it first. And I told myself this was simply appreciation for good work, the same appreciation I'd have for any craftsman whose skill exceeded his circumstances. And I wanted to be honest that this was, again, only partially true. I looked at that photograph more times over the following 2 weeks than I looked at most things I actually owned. And each time I did, I thought less about the composition and more about the man who'd stood exactly where I'd once watched him stand, looking at a lake he loved with a patience I was only beginning to understand. And each time, without entirely meaning to, I thought a little less about listing the house at all. Chapter 7. Names we don't say out loud. It was raining the night it came up properly, the kind of steady, unhurried rain that makes it reasonable for two people to stay inside past the point where either of them has an excuse to leave. And Maverick had stayed later than usual, finishing the gutter work by lamplight because the forecast had moved the rain up a day, and neither of us wanted to leave it half done. And by the time he cleaned up his tools, it was past 8 and pouring hard enough that I told him, without really thinking it through, that driving back into town in that seemed like a bad idea. And there was a second bedroom doing nothing but collecting dust, and he could take it or leave it. He took it after a pause that told me he'd weighed the offer more carefully than the words let on, and I made the kind of dinner I actually knew how to make, which is to say, a good one, because I have never accepted being mediocre at anything I do more than twice. And we ate it at the kitchen table with the rain going hard against the windows, and somewhere between the second glass of wine and the third, the careful distance we'd both been maintaining for 2 weeks got a little thinner. "Your family's not going to want to keep this place," he said, not quite a question, gesturing loosely at the house around us. I don't mean that as I just mean I've watched this happen before. Owner dies, the kids inherit, somebody comes up for 2 weeks to sort it out, and then a realtor's sign goes up by the mailbox before the leaves turn. Is that what you think I'm doing? I think that's what everybody does. He turned his glass slowly on the table, not quite looking at me. Doesn't make you a bad person. Just makes you like everybody. I don't especially want to be like everybody, I said, and I meant it more seriously than the wine should have allowed. And he looked up at that, something shifting in his face, a kind of careful attention I was starting to recognize as the thing underneath his flatness, the part of him that was always listening far more closely than he let on. What do you want, then? I didn't answer that right away, because the honest answer was forming somewhere I hadn't given it permission to form. Something about staying, something about this table and this rain and this particular quiet that I hadn't felt in longer than I wanted to admit. Something that had very little to do with the house itself, and a great deal to do with the man sitting across from me turning a wine glass in his rough, careful hands. And I was not ready that night to say any of it out loud, so instead I asked him something I'd been circling for 2 weeks. What did you do before this? Before Cedar Lake. His hand stilled on the glass. Outside, the rain kept up its steady percussion against the windows, and for a long moment I thought he was going to give me the same closed-door answer he'd given me twice already. Life happened, and let the subject drop the way it had dropped every other time. But something in the wine, or the rain, or 2 weeks of coffee handed back and forth on a porch must have worn a little of the door's hinge loose, because instead he said, quietly, looking at the table and not at me, I organized. For a few years. Housing rights mostly, then some broader work, anti-discrimination stuff, some of it specifically LGBTQ rights, depending on the city and what the fight was that year. I was good at it. I was loud. I could get a room of 200 strangers to agree on something in 20 minutes. I could get local news to show up. I could get city councils to actually vote the way we needed them to vote. People used to tell me I had a voice built for it. A short, humorless breath. That was a different person, I think. Or maybe not a different person. Maybe just a version of me that hadn't paid the bill yet. What was the bill? He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched him decide in real time how much of this he was willing to hand over, and I understood, watching that internal calculation happen behind his eyes, that I was being given something rare, and I had better be worthy of it. Got a little too visible in the wrong city at the wrong time on the wrong issue, he said finally. Lost a job over it. Not fired outright, they're smarter than that. Just made sure my contract wasn't renewed and made sure I understood why without ever saying it out loud. Lost an apartment because a landlord decided my picture in the paper wasn't good for the building's reputation. Got a few calls I don't especially want to describe in detail. Got hurt once, badly enough that I was in a hospital bed for 4 days, and told the story to a detective who wrote it all down very carefully and then, as far as I ever heard, did nothing else with it at all. He said all of this in the same level, deliberate voice. The voice of someone who had told this story to himself so many times in the dark that he'd worn all the sharp edges off the words, even though the thing underneath the words clearly still had every edge intact. And my family found out around the same time exactly what all my organizing was actually for, underneath the housing rights part, and decided they'd rather not know me any more than know that. So, that's the bill. I moved 4 times in 2 years trying to find somewhere it wouldn't catch up with me, and I ended up here. And Cedar Lake didn't ask me any questions I didn't want to answer, and I decided that was worth more to me than being loud ever was. I sat with that for a long moment, aware of how carefully I needed to hold it. The way you hold something you understand is more fragile than its letting on. I'm sorry, I said, which felt inadequate and was, but was also true. Not asking for that. He finally looked at me directly, something raw and unguarded in his face that I hadn't seen before, gone almost as soon as I registered it. Just explaining why I don't talk about the camera much, or the other thing, either. Every time I let people see the whole of what I am, somebody's found a way to make me pay for it. Got tired of paying. Decided quiet was cheaper. Is it cheaper? He looked at me for a long time before he answered, long enough that the rain seemed to get louder in the silence. Some days, he said. Other days it just feels like a different kind of expensive. I understood, sitting there, that I had just been given the truest thing he had, and that it deserved something equally true in return, and I found myself saying, before I'd fully decided to say it, I know something about that. The being careful. I've never. I stopped, started again, aware of how long it had been since I'd said any version of this sentence out loud to another living person. I've never told anyone at my company that I'm gay. Not one person in 9 years. I've let people assume things, or I've simply never corrected them, and I've told myself it's because it's nobody's business, which is true, but it's also not the whole truth. The whole truth is, I watched my father's face do something very specific once, when a cousin of mine came out at a family dinner, and I decided that night I would rather build an entire life around a door staying shut than ever see that particular expression aimed at me. Maverick didn't say anything right away. He just looked at me, something shifting behind his eyes, recalibrating, the careful cataloging look from our first meeting, except aimed, this time, at something closer to recognition than assessment. That's a heavy door to carry around for 9 years, he said finally. You'd know something about heavy doors. Yeah, he said, quiet, almost a laugh, but not quite. I guess I would. We didn't say much else that night. But something had shifted in the room, some careful distance both of us had been maintaining without naming it, and when he said good night and went down the hall to the spare room, he paused at the doorway for a second longer than he needed to, and looked back at me, and didn't say anything at all, and I understood, watching him go, that whatever this was between us had stopped being something either of us could pretend was simply neighborly. Chapter 8. The Weight of Being Careful. I have a temper. I want to say that plainly, because I think it would be dishonest to tell this story as though I simply softened into someone easy the moment I met him, and because what happened the following week is part of the truth of who I am, not an aberration from it. I'd hired a contractor out of the city, a man named Aldrich, who came recommended by a colleague, to handle the structural work on the roofline that was beyond what Maverick could safely do alone. And Aldrich's crew showed up. 9 days into my extended stay, and immediately began doing things I had not approved, cutting into original framing without checking the load calculations I'd sent over twice in writing, treating a 100-year-old post and beam structure like it was drywall they could reroute around at will. I found out about it because Maverick came and got me from the porch, quiet and a little tense, saying only, "You should probably come look at this." And I came around the side of the house and saw a support beam half removed, with nothing temporary shoring the load above it. And something in me that I usually kept on a very short, deliberate leash simply came off it. I do not remember every word I said to Aldrich. I remember it was loud, which is rare for me, and precise, which is not, a combination that apparently unsettles people more than either quality alone, because I watched 2 of his crew members physically take a step back. And I remember using the phrase structurally criminal more than once. And I remember Maverick standing a few feet off to the side, very still, watching me with an expression I couldn't read and didn't stop to try to read because I was busy being right loudly at length. Aldrich's crew left within the hour, and I spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone finding a replacement contractor. Brisk and efficient and, I told myself, entirely justified. And it wasn't, until the evening, when I found Maverick out by the boathouse coiling a length of rope with more focus than the task required, that I understood I'd left something unfinished behind me. "You've been quiet," I said. "Been a quiet kind of day." "That's not what I mean." He set the rope down and looked at me for a moment, weighing something. "You were right to stop them. That beam was load-bearing. They'd have taken half the second floor down with it eventually." I'm not arguing the call. A pause. You get a certain way when you're angry. Precise, cold almost. It's effective, I'll give you that. But it's not exactly a comfortable thing to stand next to. I felt that land the way true things land, with a small, sharp discomfort I wasn't used to letting myself feel in front of another person. "You think I was cruel to him?" I think you were right and cruel at the same time, and I think you didn't need the second part to get the first part done. He wasn't accusing me, exactly. His voice stayed level and careful the way it always did, but there was something underneath it. Some old caution I recognized now as the specific wariness of a man who had spent years learning to read the room for the exact moment a person's temper might turn and land on him. I've had people be right at me in that tone before. It doesn't feel good, even when they're right, especially when they're right. I stood with that for a long moment, turning it over the way I turn over drawings I've gotten wrong, looking for the exact point where the load didn't transfer the way I'd assumed it would. I'm not angry at you, I said. I know that. But I frightened you a little, just now or earlier, watching that. He didn't answer right away, which was its own kind of answer, and I felt something in my chest go tight with a specific unfamiliar shame. Not the shame of having been wrong, which I was well practiced at metabolizing, but the shame of having been someone's discomfort without meaning to be. Someone whose temper had cost another person even a moment of the safety he'd fought so hard to build for himself. I'm sorry, I said, not for stopping the work, for how I did it in front of you without thinking about what that kind of precision might cost someone standing close enough to feel the edge of it. That wasn't fair to you. He looked up at that, something in his face shifting, surprise mostly, the particular surprise of a man unused to receiving an apology that didn't come with an asterisk attached to it. Not many people walk that back, he said quietly. In my experience, usually it's the being right part that gets remembered and the being cruel part that gets excused. I don't want to be a person you have to brace for, I said, and I meant it with a seriousness that surprised even me, coming out of my own mouth. I have a temper. I've never had much reason to work on softening it, because it's mostly served me well, professionally. But it shouldn't cost you anything. Not you specifically. Something eased in his shoulders, a loosening I hadn't realized was there until it released. All right, he said. I believe you. A beat, almost wry. Doesn't mean I won't flinch a little next time you go precise on somebody. Old habits. That's fair, I said. I'll try to keep the precision aimed at contractors who deserve it and nowhere near you at all. He almost smiled at that, the real thing, not the careful near laugh from before, and something in me settled to see it. Some proof that the apology had actually landed and actually mattered, and hadn't simply been absorbed the way people absorb obligatory contrition and move on unchanged. We ended up sitting on the dock that evening, the new cedar half and the old gray half, watching the light go down over water that had gone the color of hammered pewter, not talking much, close enough that our shoulders occasionally brushed. When one of us shifted, and neither of us moved away when it happened, which felt at the time like the loudest thing either of us had said to the other all day. Can I ask you something? He said eventually into the quiet. Go ahead. That thing you said the other night about never telling anyone at your company. He was looking at the water, not at me, giving me the same courtesy of not watching too closely that I'd learned by then was his particular way of making hard questions easier to answer. Do you regret it? The not telling. All these years. I thought about that honestly, for longer than the question probably expected. I used to think I didn't, I said. I used to think it was simply a sensible boundary, private life separate from professional life, the same boundary anyone reasonable would keep. But sitting here, now, I think I've been lonely in a specific shape for a long time and called it privacy because the other word felt too much like admitting the cost. I looked over at him, at the line of his jaw in the fading light, at the careful, patient stillness of a man who had learned to sit with hard things without flinching from them. I don't know if I regret it exactly, but I think I'm starting to understand what it cost. He didn't say anything to that, not right away. He just reached over, slow, careful, the same careful he did everything with, and set his hand over mine on the weathered dockboard between us, and I turned my hand over to meet it, and we sat like that until the light was almost entirely gone. Two men who had each spent years perfecting the art of staying safely unseen, finally, cautiously, choosing to be seen by exactly one other person in all the world. It felt, I remember thinking, like the most reckless thing either of us had done in years. It also felt, somehow, like the safest. Chapter 9: What Almost Happened at the Bonfire. Amber Hollow held an end-of-summer bonfire on the public beach every year, Ruthie told me. The whole town more or less required to show up by some unwritten local law, and Maverick mentioned it almost, apologetically, the way you mention an obligation you'd rather skip but can't quite justify skipping. And I told him I'd go if he was going, which was as close as either of us had come, out loud, to acknowledging that we were now the kind of two people who went places together. "It's not," he started and stopped, and I watched him work through how to phrase it. "People will see us there, together. It's a small town, Kamari. Nobody's going to make a scene, but they notice things, and they talk. Kindly mostly, but they talk." "Do you not want me to come?" "I want you to come!" Fast, more certain than the hesitation before it had suggested. "I just want you to know what you're walking into. Once people here decide two men showing up to things together means something, that's not really a thing you can walk back, not in a town this size. I've kept myself pretty carefully unremarkable for 4 years. I don't know what it does to that, you standing next to me at a bonfire." "I've kept myself carefully unremarkable for 21 years, I said. "I think I understand the stakes." I reached over and took his hand, right there in the kitchen, a small gesture that felt enormous. "I'd like to come anyway." The bonfire was exactly what I'd pictured, and somehow warmer than that, too. A big driftwood fire on the public beach, kids running feral in the dark near the waterline, someone's ancient speaker playing music that skipped every few songs, Ruthie presiding over a folding table of food with the specific authority of a woman who'd organized this same event for 30 years and would organize it for 30 more. People said hello to Maverick with an easy familiarity that told me he was more woven into this place than his careful, solitary habits let on, and several of them said hello to me too by name, which meant word of the nephew staying. Up at Elias's place had traveled the whole circumference of the town in under 2 weeks. We didn't touch, not obviously, not in a way that announced anything, but we stood close. And there's a particular kind of closeness two people can hold in a crowd that isn't quite public and isn't quite private either. A closeness made of small unconscious orientations. The angle of a shoulder, the specific ease of not needing to perform conversation with each other the way you perform it with everyone else in the circle. I caught myself, more than once, simply watching him laugh at something one of Pete's kids said. The real laugh, unguarded. The one I'd started to understand he only let out around people who'd earned enough trust to see it, and feeling something in my chest that I hadn't let myself feel about another person in longer than I could accurately measure. Later, when the fire had burned down to something more manageable and most of the families had drifted home with sleepy kids over their shoulders, we ended up walking down the shoreline away from the last of the stragglers, the water black and quiet beside us, the fire a small orange smear behind us in the dark. "I haven't done this in a long time," Maverick said, apropos of nothing, hands in his pockets, looking out at the water instead of at me. "Let myself want something like this. Somebody. I got real practiced at deciding I didn't need it after everything. Told myself it was safer that way, and mostly I believed it. And now..." He stopped walking and turned to look at me properly, the firelight too far away now to catch much of his face, just the shape of him against the dark water and the darker tree line. "Now I'm standing on a beach with a man who talked to a contractor like a loaded weapon and apologized to me an hour later like it actually mattered to him, who framed a photograph I gave him and hung it where he'd see it every day, who drove up here to sell a house and hasn't called the realtor in 2 weeks. I don't know what to do with that, Kamari. I stopped letting myself hope for things a long time ago, because hoping for things is what got me hurt in the first place." "I'm not asking you to hope for anything you're not ready to hope for," I said, "but I'd like to be worth the risk, if you'll let me try." He was quiet for a moment, close enough now that I could feel the warmth of him even in the cool night air, and then he said, low, rough at the edges the way his voice got when he wasn't being careful about it, "You already are. That's the problem. I wasn't planning on that happening." I closed the last of the distance between us, slow, giving him every chance to step back if he needed to, and he didn't, and the kiss, when it came, was careful at first and then not careful at all. the particular unguarded hunger of two men who had each spent years being extremely careful about everything and had simply finally run out of caution in exactly the same moment. The water lapped quietly against the shore a few feet away. Somewhere behind us, the fire popped and settled. I don't know how long we stood there, only that it felt like the first entirely honest thing my body had done in longer than I wanted to think about. And when we finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine for a moment, breathing unsteady, and laughed, quiet and a little disbelieving. "Well," he said, "there goes unremarkable. I'll take the blame for that one. I'm not looking for anyone to blame." He pulled back just enough to look at me properly, something soft and unguarded in his face that I understood, even then, was a rare and specific gift. The face underneath the careful vigilance, offered freely for once instead of extracted by circumstance. Just wasn't expecting it, any of it. You, or wanting this again, or believing for about 30 seconds that it might actually be safe to. It might not be entirely safe, I said, honestly, because I owed him that much. I don't know how this goes for either of us in the long run, but I'd like to find out with you instead of finding it out alone, which is the only way I've found anything out for the last 21 years. He didn't answer with words. He kissed me again instead, slower this time, and somewhere down the beach, one of the last stragglers called out a good night to no one in particular, and neither of us moved apart in a hurry. And I remember thinking, with a clarity that startled me, that whatever came next, however complicated it turned out to be, I did not regret a single second of having let this happen. I did not yet know how soon and how badly I would test the truth of that thought.